The Vikings terrified medieval Europe for 3 centuries. They burned cities, shattered kingdoms, and sailed wherever they pleased. To most people, the sight of a Viking fleet on the horizon meant only one thing: death. But in the cold waters of the Baltic Sea, something happened that shattered that legend forever. Entire Viking fleets vanished. Warriors who had faced emperors and kings without fear began whispering about demons in the forests to the east. Because on those shores lived tribes who did something no one thought possible. They didn't run from the Vikings, they hunted them. 0 survivors. That was the only number that mattered when the smoke cleared above the gray waters of the Baltic Sea. 60 Swedish warships, ships that once carried the most feared raiders in Europe, had been reduced to shattered timber and drifting corpses in less than an hour. These were Vikings, the same men who had sailed up the Seine and terrorized Paris, the same warriors who had battered the walls of Constantinople itself. For centuries they had been the wolves of Europe, predators that descended from the sea to take whatever they wanted. But here, on the eastern edge of the Baltic, the wolves had found something unexpected. They had found bears. Deep in the forests of what we now call Estonia and Latvia lived tribes whose names barely survive in modern history. The Curonians, the Osalians. To the rest of Europe, they were obscure forest people. To Viking kings, they became something far more terrifying. They became hunters. For nearly 300 years, the Baltic Sea had been, in practice, a Swedish lake. Viking fleets crossed it constantly. Raids were routine. Slaves, furs, and amber flowed westward into Scandinavian markets. To the Norse kings, the eastern coast was not a threat. It was a warehouse. And like every empire that grows too comfortable, they stopped paying attention. The first signs were easy to dismiss: a ship that failed to return, a Danish patrol that disappeared near the island of Saaremaa. Merchants in the Swedish trading city of Sigtuna blamed storms or bad navigation. After all, Vikings didn't lose fights to tribal fishermen. But they weren't fishermen anymore. Hidden in narrow inlets and forested shipyards along the Baltic coast, the tribes had been watching for generations. They had studied the Viking longships, studied their tactics, studied their weaknesses, and then they began building ships of their own. These vessels were different from the famous Viking drakars. They were lighter, faster, and designed for the shallow maze of islands, reefs, and hidden sandbanks that filled the Baltic coastline, places where the heavier Scandinavian ships could easily run aground. In open sea, the Vikings were unstoppable, but close to shore, in a labyrinth of rocks and narrow channels, the hunters now had the advantage. The moment that changed everything began quietly on a summer morning. A lookout stood atop a coastal fortress on the island of Gotland. At first, he thought the shapes on the horizon were shadows in the mist. The sails looked wrong. They were dark instead of the bright striped canvas of Scandinavian fleets. And they weren't sailing in disciplined lines. They were coming in a swarm. Dozens of ships cut through the water at frightening speed, moving like a pack of wolves rather than a fleet. The garrison froze as they realized what they were seeing. Osalian raiders, and they were not coming to trade. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The attackers moved with terrifying precision. Grappling hooks slammed into the sides of anchored Swedish ships, but instead of boarding them like Vikings normally would, the raiders did something unexpected. They threw fire. Clay pots filled with burning pitch smashed across the decks. Torches followed. Bags of quicklime exploded into choking clouds of white dust. And then came something even worse. Pots filled with venomous snakes.
Within minutes, the proud Swedish warships had become floating nightmares. Flames climbed the sails, smoke blinded the crews, snakes writhed across the decks while warriors stumbled half-blind through burning rigging. Men who had fought Saxons and Franks without hesitation suddenly panicked. Some leaped overboard in full armor, choosing to drown rather than face the chaos spreading across the ships. But death was not the only thing the Vikings feared that day, because they had heard the stories. Stories of what these Baltic tribes did with prisoners. According to Norse legends whispered among sailors, captured warriors were not always enslaved. Some were taken deep into forest sanctuaries where pagan priests sacrificed them to ancient gods. The future was read in the entrails of defeated Vikings. For a warrior raised to believe he would reach Valhalla with sword in hand, that fate was worse than death. And fear spreads faster than fire. Within an hour, the Swedish fleet had ceased to exist. Burning ships drifted across the waves, while the victorious raiders vanished back into the maze of islands that only they truly understood. 2 days later, fishermen near Sigtuna discovered the wreckage washing ashore. Bodies floated in the shallows. Some had been beheaded. Others had been impaled with ash-wood spears and left standing upright in the sand. The message was unmistakable. The Baltic Sea no longer belonged to the Vikings. Back in Sigtuna, when the news finally reached King Canute Eriksson, the reaction was not grief, it was panic. Because a king who cannot defend his own waters does not remain king. Rival clans begin whispering. Allies begin reconsidering their loyalties. Power in the Viking world was built on strength, and strength had just been humiliated. The king needed revenge, fast. So instead of fortifying Sweden's coastlines, he made the decision that would seal the fate of thousands of men. He ordered the full mobilization of the royal fleet, 300 ships, 10,000 warriors. The Ledang, the ancient naval levy of the Scandinavian kings, gathered beneath the summer sun. Steel glinted along the Stockholm archipelago as ships prepared to sail east. Priests blessed the sails. Families waved goodbye from the docks. It looked like the return of Viking glory. But hidden among the merchants and traders walking the busy streets of Sigtuna were men who quietly counted every ship leaving the harbor and memorized the exact day they departed. Spies. And before the Swedish fleet had even reached the eastern coast of the Baltic, a single small vessel slipped quietly out of the harbor and sailed south. Its destination was the forest strongholds of the Curonians. Its message was only one sentence: "The nest is empty."
The Swedish fleet sailed east, expecting glory. 300 ships cut across the Baltic under bright summer skies. 10,000 warriors stood packed along their decks, shields polished, axes sharpened, convinced they were about to teach the eastern tribes a lesson they would never forget. For centuries that had been the pattern. The Vikings arrived, villages burned, survivors fled into the forests, then the raiders sailed home with slaves and gold. But when the Swedish fleet finally reached the shores of Curonia, something felt wrong. The beaches were empty. No defenders waited along the coast, no warriors gathered with shields and spears. The villages near the shore stood silent, their doors hanging open, cooking fires cold, livestock gone. It was as if the entire population had vanished. At first, the Swedish commanders laughed. They assumed the tribes had fled in terror. Confident and impatient, they ordered their army ashore and began marching inland through the forests, hunting an enemy that refused to appear. That was the moment the war truly began.
Because while 10,000 Vikings marched deeper into unfamiliar territory, 300 kilometers away across the sea, a different fleet was already moving. Black sails appeared through the morning mist of the Swedish archipelago. But these ships were not heading toward an army. They were heading toward a city, Sigtuna, the jewel of Sweden, the commercial heart of the kingdom and the seat of royal power, now defended only by old men, merchants, and boys too young to join the fleet. At dawn, the surface of Lake Mälaren usually lay silent beneath drifting white fog. The fishermen knew the quiet well. It was the calm before the day began. But on that morning, the silence shattered. 1,000 oars struck the water at once. The fog broke apart as dark ships glided forward like shadows. The harbor barriers meant to stop heavy trading vessels did nothing against the shallow Baltic ships. They slid over the submerged obstacles with terrifying ease. And then the raiders came ashore. They did not form battle lines. They did not shout challenges or demand surrender. They ran. Baltic warriors leapt from the prows before their ships even touched sand. They wore hardened leather instead of the heavy mail favored by the Norse. They carried short axes and curved blades designed for speed rather than duels. Within minutes, the harbor was burning. The city guard rushed to the gates, but what they saw froze them in place. It wasn't an army approaching the walls. It was a tide. Men poured into the streets faster than defenders could organize. Torches flew through windows. Shops and warehouses erupted in flame. The main gate of Sigtuna fell in less than 15 minutes. Panic spread through the city like wildfire. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away in the forests of Caronia, the Swedish king was beginning to realize something was terribly wrong. His army had been marching for days, chasing rumors of enemy forces that vanished like smoke. The guides they captured led them through swamps where armored warriors sank waist-deep in black mud. Horses broke their legs in hidden marshes. The enemy remained invisible. Every night a few sentries disappeared. No screams, no alarms, just helmets found in the moss the next morning. The forest itself seemed to be fighting them. Back in Sigtuna, the massacre reached its darkest moment inside the cathedral. Archbishop Johannes, the most powerful religious figure in Sweden, had taken refuge at the altar with dozens of terrified civilians. They believed the church would protect them. Even raiders would respect holy ground. They were wrong. The attackers smashed through the cathedral doors with improvised rams. Splintered wood echoed through the stone hall as warriors poured inside. They did not hesitate. The archbishop was dragged to the steps of the altar and beheaded. His blood soaked into the sacred floor while the raiders stripped the church of its treasures. But they wanted more than gold. They dismantled the magnificent bronze doors of the cathedral itself, massive works of art symbolizing the pride of the Swedish kingdom, and loaded them onto their ships as trophies. When the raiders finally left, Sigtuna was a blackened ruin. Smoke from the burning city drifted across the countryside for kilometers. Survivors hiding in nearby forests watched their world collapse into ash. The message could not have been clearer. The Vikings were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. Days later, exhausted and frustrated, King Canute finally ordered his army to retreat back to the coast. The forests had swallowed their campaign. Supplies were running low. Nothing had been gained. But when the vanguard reached the beach where the fleet waited, King Canute felt his blood run cold. Ships still floated in the harbor, but many of them were burning. A small Coronian raiding force had struck the fleet's rear guard while the army was inland. Guards lay dead along the sand with black arrows lodged in their throats. Chaos erupted across the shoreline as warriors scrambled to save what remained of their ships. And then a small fishing boat appeared from the western horizon. The vessel looked half destroyed, its sail torn and blackened with soot. The man steering it staggered onto the beach and collapsed at the king's feet. Canute grabbed him by the collar. "What happened?" The messenger struggled to breathe. "The city, Sigtuna, it's gone. The archbishop is dead. They took the doors." Silence fell across the beach. 10,000 hardened Viking warriors lowered their eyes. They had not been defeated by a stronger army. They had simply been outplayed, and the humiliation was not over yet, because the only way home was across the Baltic Sea, and the tribes who had burned their capital were already waiting for them there.
The return across the Baltic should have been a relief. Instead, it became a nightmare. The Swedish fleet, reduced, exhausted, and shaken, left the hostile shores behind and pushed westward toward home. What remained of the once mighty armada sailed in tight formation, ships clustered together like a herd of animals sensing predators nearby. But the Baltic Sea is not an open ocean, it is a maze. Thousands of islands, hidden sandbanks, and narrow passages twist through its gray waters. To sailors who know them well, these waters are a playground. To frightened crews navigating unfamiliar routes, they are a trap. King Canute understood the danger. The enemy would not allow them to simply leave. The tribes had already proven they were patient, calculating, and ruthless. They had burned Sweden's capital. Now they wanted something more valuable. They wanted the king's fleet. Near the island of Gotland, the trap finally closed. Fog crept across the water in the afternoon, thick and heavy. Visibility shrank until the horizon vanished entirely. The Swedish ships pushed forward carefully, their lookouts straining to see through the gray curtain. And then the shapes appeared. Small ships, fast ones. They seemed to materialize from the mist itself, painted in dull colors that blended with the water and sky. They did not approach in neat formations. They darted between the larger Swedish vessels like wolves circling wounded prey. The Vikings prepared for boarding. That was how sea battles were fought. You close the distance, crashed ships together, and let warriors decide the outcome with steel. But the Baltic raiders had studied their enemy too well. They never tried to board. Instead, they attacked the sails. Clay jars filled with boiling fat and burning pitch arced through the air and smashed against the towering masts. Fire spread across the canvas like a living creature, devouring rigging and ropes in seconds. Panic erupted. A ship without sails is helpless, and fire at sea is the most terrifying enemy a sailor can face. There is nowhere to run, no ground to retreat onto. Only two choices remain: burn or drown. One of the first ships to fall behind belonged to Jarl Ulf, a veteran warrior feared throughout Scandinavia. Furious, he ordered his vessel to turn and ram the attackers. But his heavy ship moved too slowly. The smaller Baltic boats circled it with frightening speed, hurling spears and fire pots while staying just out of reach. The once powerful warship drifted helplessly as its sails burned above the deck. Piece by piece, the attackers dismantled it. King Canute watched from his flagship. He knew what was happening. If he stopped to save every damaged vessel, the entire fleet would be surrounded. The only chance for survival was to keep moving. So he made the coldest decision a commander can make. He ordered the fleet forward. Behind them, the screams of burning sailors faded into the fog. 2 days later, the surviving ships finally sighted the Swedish coast. No cheers rose from the decks.
The smell reached them first. Burnt wood, rotting flesh. As the fleet entered the waters near Sigtuna, the warriors stared in silence. The city they had left weeks earlier was no longer a city. It was a grave. The docks where they had played as children were blackened skeletons of timber. Merchant houses had collapsed into piles of ash. Smoke still drifted through the ruins like ghosts refusing to leave. King Canute stepped ashore onto a beach covered in gray dust. Each footstep kicked small clouds of ash into the air. He walked slowly toward the cathedral ruins. Where bronze doors had once stood, there was now only an empty frame and swarms of flies buzzing in the summer heat. In the central square, survivors emerged from the forests. Men, women, and children stared at their returning king, but their expressions were not filled with relief. They were filled with doubt. A ruler who cannot protect his own capital is not a king. He is only a man wearing a crown. Canute removed his helmet and let it fall onto the ground. The metal echoed across the silent square like a funeral bell. He understood the truth. The Vikings had not been defeated by a stronger empire. They had been defeated by tribes they once considered primitive. But across the Baltic Sea, the victors were learning a dangerous lesson of their own. Victory breeds ambition. The Curonians and Essalians had shattered Viking power in the region. They had burned the capital of Sweden itself. For the first time, the hunters of the forest realized something shocking. They could dominate the sea. But ambition is a double-edged sword. Flush with success, the tribes began looking southward toward new enemies, new lands, and greater glory. They believed they had defeated the most dangerous warriors in Europe. They believed no one could challenge them. What they did not understand yet was that the Vikings, for all their terror, were not the most relentless enemy Europe could produce. Far to the south, behind the stone walls of German castles, men were watching the Baltic carefully. Men who did not fight for gold, men who did not fight for pride, men who believed they were fighting for God Himself. Soon, armored crusaders would march north under the banner of the cross, and the wars that followed would make Viking raids look like small skirmishes in comparison. But the legend of that first humiliation would never fade, because long before crusaders arrived, before kingdoms rose, before empires spread across the forests, there was a moment when the most feared warriors in Europe looked across the Baltic Sea and felt something they had never felt before: fear. The Vikings had spent centuries hunting the world, until the day they discovered that somewhere in the deep forests of the East, something was hunting them.